Hi, everyone. My name is Yvonne Castillo. I am the Director of Risk Management at Victor US. Thank you for joining us today. This program, in partnership with the AIA Trust, is called Demystifying ESG for Design Firms, Risks, and Opportunities. So I want to use my time wisely today, since we're only together for 30 minutes. What I want to be careful about is to set some clear guardrails on nomenclature and try to avoid conflating ESG with climate. Because while climate risks are a very important part of ESG, the mitigation and adaptation efforts that are underway, ESG is a much broader topic. It's related to corporate performance as a whole, and it involves issues beyond climate, and we're going to talk about them in a moment, but it involves issues related to the intersection between the natural environment, the built environment, supply chains, and a host of other environmental and social issues. And with that, it carries unique risks and opportunities. So if you do want to learn more about climate risks and their impacts on design firms, feel free to access the other webinars that we have recorded and on our website. But today we're going to talk about ESG in 3 parts. So first, I'm going to start with an overview of ESG. Then I'm going to move on to how ESG impacts design firms. And then lastly, we're going to talk about ESG sustainability accounting standards and how to help you take your next steps. So what is ESG? So it is an acronym that stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. And what it is, it's an investment strategy that helps lenders, investors, and underwriters understand the sustainability profile of a company. The word sustainability in an ESG context is not sustainability as it relates, or not just to sustainability as it relates to the planet, but it is sustainability of people, society, businesses as a whole. In other words, when investors in the financial community are using ESG strategies, they are looking for companies that are resilient against environmental and societal disruptive risks. And what they are doing is honing in on those that are future fit economically for the long haul. So the challenge, however, that you've been hearing about in the news, for the financial world at least, is using this investment strategy and getting the right information and data that's relevant, that's standardized, that's trusted, that will help them compare companies and understand where to allocate capital. So in a moment, we're going to talk about how ESG information is becoming standardized in the marketplace and in regulatory arenas. But for purposes of today, or for the moment, let's just keep going and talk about what ESG is and how to think about it. So it is metaphorically a peek under the hood of a company. ESG data and information gives investors deeper information about a company to understand better what ESG risks the company has that could either compromise its long-term financial outlook on one side, or on the flip side, could reveal a company's unique strategic positioning in a changing world. You can kind of think of it similar to a credit rating, but instead of the rating of an organization to fulfill a financial commitment, like a credit rating is, it's about the ability of a company to be resilient and resilient to economic, environmental, and social shocks. And really, it's about the ability of a company to thrive through those disruptions. The general idea on how financial institutions would assess ESG and their end goal looks a little bit like this. So you can see here, the end goal is pricing risks and capital allocation. So in theory, once the regulatory dust settles globally, because there's a lot of activity right now, companies are all going to be disclosing ESG performance and data, and they're going to be disclosing the same information in a standardized format, or at least equal information. By disclosing that information, investors or the financial community and institutions and insurers can then compare companies. And then when they can compare companies, they can then more meaningfully allocate capital to companies that are good risks and great sustainable investments. The question that you are seeing in the news and that is being hotly debated around ESG is, what information exactly do these investors and financial institutions need to help them make cogent, long-term financially material decisions in their lending practices, their underwriting, and their investing. And geographically, there are different approaches. Given time constraints, I'm going to focus on a brief comparison about how US markets are dealing with financial materiality versus Europe. So in US markets, for example, financial materiality tends to be viewed more narrowly than in European markets. In the US, financially material ESG information relates to information that paints a picture on how environmental and societal factors are impacting a business's bottom line. So you can see the question here that I've posed: how does the environment and society impact my business? So businesses in the United States, this is the question you would ask yourself, or design firms in particular. And this is called single financial materiality. And it's focused on how vulnerable a company might be to ESG risks. When you compare that to European markets, on the other hand, financial materiality is a much broader approach, and it solicits information not just about the impact of environment and society on a company, but it also explores how a business model and its corporate management of ESG risks could negatively or positively impact the environment and society. And this is what is called double financial materiality. It's a two-way analysis, it's much more holistic, and it's much broader in thinking. There is debate, by the way, on whether the US should follow the broader European model. That has not been settled, so you might want to keep an eye on that. The other geographic distinction that I want to raise today is that ESG disclosure requirements in Europe are mandatory. They are not voluntary like in US markets. And parenthetically, I should note quickly that there is quite a debate on whether the current Securities and Exchange Commission rules already require ESG disclosure of publicly listed companies, because certain ESG information and data is arguably already considered financially material, or that is already considered financially material, may need to be disclosed. But to keep things simple for today, we're going to focus on what is top of mind, at least in the markets, related to SEC regulation, and that is the proposed climate disclosure rules. And these were proposed by the Commission in the spring of 2021. They are expected to be adopted later this year, but no one really ever knows at this point, because there are so many debates going on related to the SEC. But two things you should note on these proposed rules. First, it's notable that the proposed disclosures are really narrowly framed to climate disclosure, and that these rules actually would compel companies to disclose things like greenhouse gas emissions in both directly and in their supply chains, as well as including some climate resiliency related information in those disclosures. They are not broader ESG disclosures, as we're going to talk about in a moment. And there is a difference. You'll see that when we move on to that area of this webinar. But the second thing is the SEC has jurisdiction over publicly traded companies only. So climate disclosure rules will not be mandatory for private companies. However, as a privately held company in the United States, there are other market-based reasons you might want to have an ESG track record, including specifically on climate, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So first, let's take a look at the types of business-related issues that fall into the various E, S, and G categories generally. So I created this graphic based on general sustainability accounting disclosure standards. It is by no means a comprehensive categorization of all disclosure topics within the E, S, and G subjects, but I just couldn't fit it all on the slide. In an effort to simplify today's introductory discussion, I thought it would be helpful to at least give you a flavor for the types of information being sought out from companies under E, S, and G. So for example, if you look at the environmental category on the far left, you can see right here, climate change certainly is a part of environmental disclosures. And as it relates to climate risk, investors and financial institutions are keenly interested in how a company that they are lending to, underwriting, or investing in, how they might be managing their business and protecting against physical risks of severe weather to their own capital assets, or how a company is scenario planning for those cascading impacts on from those severe weather events on supply chain or business interruptions. Also, how a company is positioning itself against what are called transition risks of a net zero or low carbon economy. And what I mean by that is, how is the company anticipating changes in regulations, laws that would favor a clean energy business over a non-clean energy business or a fossil fuel reliant business, net zero development activities, and basically understanding better how a company's market share is going to be impacted by these transitions. And also how a company looks. What is its carbon footprint, as I mentioned earlier in the climate-related disclosures that the SEC is proposing. And then finally, staying with climate risks, how a company might be the target of a negligence lawsuit for failing to protect against the physical risks of climate change and harm to people and property, or the risks that a service or a product worsens global warming with more greenhouse gas emissions. And all of those, so all of those subjects, what I'm teasing out here, this is all within climate change, the climate change disclosure bucket. As you can see on this graph or this visual, there are also other issues like biodiversity loss related to the environment, liability risks related to air and water pollution, natural resource stewardship. So will shortages in resources like water, minerals, lumber, energy, will these impact a company's ability to profit or remain relevant? And then finally, things like solid waste generation and the circular economy. So again, this is sort of generally just giving you a flavor for the kinds of issues that fall under environmental disclosures. So let's move on to social. As you can see here, a lot of topics related to social, but generally speaking, the things they are looking for, the questions they are asking businesses is, for example, is your business at risk for lawsuits because it doesn't have proper policies or trainings in place to manage harassment or discrimination claims? Or how is your company strategically managing talent shortages, which is a pervasive challenge for many, many industries today? Is your business protecting against or protecting the safety and welfare of its employees, or are there dangers that are could expose it to litigation for unsafe practices or work-related injuries? And then you can see here, ethics is a big category, especially for the design and construction industry as it relates to violation of procurement laws. And then finally, cyber issues. So cyber breaches and protection of data. That's what the disclosure is looking for. How are companies managing those kinds of risks? And then finally, governance right here. These are the quality controls, or you can call them risk management controls, that companies have in place to manage both E and S risks. So things like the people, how they are being trained, how are they being continually upskilled, board structure of a company, its accountability for E and S issues, policies and procedures that the company might have in place. So that's generally risk management controls. All right, so and reporting controls as well. So let's connect the dots a bit on how ESG impacts the design industry more specifically. So overall, in my view, the stars are aligned for design firms as it relates to ESG opportunities. Let's talk about the 3 reasons why. So first, on the far left, ESG is fundamentally about long-term thinking, and a pervasive challenge for design firms, as you all know, has been the early conversations you have with your owner clients about upfront quality investment decisions in the project and thinking about the long-term value of a project. That has always been a challenge where upfront costs are valued or tend to be valued more than long-term total cost of ownership. That conversation with ESG tailwinds, I believe, is going to continue to get easier because owners of capital assets require financing, funding, and insurance. And with investors and financial institutions under pressure to peek under the hood, as I mentioned earlier, and to understand better the companies they are lending to, underwriting, or investing in, you may indeed see that or experience a much easier time with your owner clients in those early discussions, so that the focus becomes more about the total cost of ownership of that project, and they can relate those investments back to ESG principles and regulatory oversight and reporting. Also, I noted here in this first star, there is eager capital and plenty of it for ESG related investments. According to Bloomberg Intelligence, global ESG assets are set to climb to 50 trillion by 2025 from about 35 trillion in today. You can see from 2016 it being at 22.8 trillion, then 30.7 trillion, according to the Global Sustainable Investment Association. There is clearly an acceleration and growth pattern that we can see in ESG asset growth. Okay, let's look at the second reason that ESG momentum is building opportunity for design firms, and that is the federal policy landscape. I created this graph to give you kind of an overview of what we're seeing today or in recent history, just in the last couple of years. I broke it up into the legislative, congressional activity that's happening, regulatory activity, and executive actions from the White House. So a quick note on ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. So this act, of course, you can see here on the screen, $362 billion in federal investments. The themes of those federal investments are related to affordable housing, mobility, climate change and resiliency acceleration, social equity, and healing historic scars of underinvestment and poor zoning decisions in low and moderate income neighborhoods. The thread of those same themes are threaded into the next legislative package here, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, also known as the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. What's notable here is it's a $1.2 trillion bill, but 550 billion of it is brand new money, brand new investments. And those dollars are really focused on pretty much every area of infrastructure in the United States, but with similar resiliency and climate themes as the ARPA bill. The US really is hedging its bets and investing in multiple clean technologies and multiple ways to get to net zero. So for example, if you look at the new law, I mean, it's investments in accelerating solar, wind, hydro, battery storage tech for the power sector, lots and lots of money for transportation and scaling electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, advancing energy efficiency and advancing or more R&D into early stage clean tech like carbon capture and utilization, long duration storage, and advanced nuclear is also seeing a renaissance in the markets because of this investment. And then more hydro where it makes sense. And also lastly, there is a, you've probably heard about it, but a new program to monitor and reduce methane leaks at orphan wells. So just a massive infrastructure bill that was a long time overdue, and it will accelerate the ESG momentum. And then lastly here on the legislative side, the Inflation Reduction Act. This is basically known as, while it covers some other healthcare issues, it's really known as the most historic climate bill in United States history. It, you can see here on the slide, $369 billion focused on climate and energy provisions. It really does double down on the clean energy transition of the bipartisan bill, but goes even further because it's putting the weight of federal investment behind, economic conditions to make it financially feasible and attractive, for example, for businesses, utilities, and individuals to make clean choices, and really does completely alter the environmental, social, and governance factors for investors. And it is still early. This bill just passed a couple of months ago in August of this year. So I think the dust is still settling. Investors are trying to get their heads around what this actually means, but this will continue to accelerate the activity of ESG in the United States. Then moving on to the regulatory column here, as I mentioned earlier, the proposed climate disclosure rules. That's relating to greenhouse gas reporting mostly, but also some resiliency reporting that follows the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures framework. We'll talk about that in a second. It is expected to be adopted No one knows for sure when exactly, hopefully this year, but it may be early next year. There are legal challenges, I think, that unfortunately put some confusion into the market. I think most investors are looking for clarity. So unfortunately, I don't know whether that will happen right away, but there will be legal challenges as soon as it is adopted. But it's important to note that the SEC has increased their enforcement actions under the current rules related to ESG for how they are authorized to manage ESG issues in terms of financial materiality. So I don't believe oversight is going to go away. In fact, the SEC has its own climate and ESG task force within their division of enforcement to identify ESG related misconduct. So I think we're going to see increased enforcement activity over the coming months and years. So what this slide, and then there's also White House actions. We'll have a webinar here related to this Buy Clean initiative for federal procurement in November, so keep an eye on that. But there's just lots of executive orders connecting the dots between these legislative and regulatory actions. So more regulatory oversight coming, I guess is the point I'm making here. But do please note that experts are saying that we should expect a very bumpy ride over the next decade because a lot of this involves systemic change in financial and energy markets with the post-COVID recovery complication, now the Ukraine crisis throwing a wrench into energy supplies and energy security and affordability. Things are definitely going to be bumpy for a while because this is a lot of change happening all at once. But keep your eye on the horizon, and positioning your firm strategically as an ESG-focused solution provider would be well advised. So moving on to the last point I want to make here related to the momentum is the demand for sustainable design services. There is a massive uptick of net zero commitments ever since last year's COP26, the Conference of the Parties. This was the International Climate Talks in Glasgow. There's a campaign called Race to Zero, where members representing over 52 regions around the world have committed to accelerated climate action in line with, number one, reducing global emissions in half by 2030, so in 8 years, and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So to get a sense of the momentum behind this Race to Zero campaign, a few statistics that I think are informative. Over 7,500 companies have committed to these pledges, or these net zero emission pledges. Over 1,100 cities, over 1,100 educational institutions, 550 financial institutions, over 3,000 hospitals, and then lastly, over 60 healthcare institutions. And now that those organizations have committed to these ambitious pledges, many are now developing what are called climate transition plans. And these climate transition plans are intended to help them hit these net zero targets with real milestones and measurable strategies to get them there. So really does propel the activity for ESG. There's a lot of pressure, as I mentioned, for these entities in literally 8 years to hit those 2030 targets. So more and more pressure for the financial world to make some progress and demonstrate it meaningfully. Now, this is all good news for sustainable service providers. Many of you who provide these services, if you don't currently provide sustainable design services, we advise that you explore an enhanced scope of our business model to unlock that ESG value proposition in a growing market, whether it is energy efficiency, weatherization, or climate adaptation or emissions reduction services, or digging deeper into low, no carbon materials to specify on your projects, or engineering firms who are or maybe thinking about becoming experts in green hydrogen, battery storage and technology, long-term storage, advanced nuclear, advanced geothermal, or really any other technology or manners of delivery that are reducing waste, like modular construction. The opportunity really is yours. The market share is there. So for those of you who want to take it, you're in a very strong position to position yourself right now in the market and for decades to come. Okay, so we talked about the opportunities. Let's pivot now to risks. So what risks do you face with ESG? Again, I'm separating climate risks and the related liability risks with ESG. To me, ESG risks are really business risks because remember, ESG is a strategy used by investors to lend, underwrite, or invest in companies. So what's at risk for you is mostly market share. With the growth that has been projected in ESG related funds, as I showed you on an earlier slide, and seeing how the policy world is managing these issues, it is a really good bet on the side of growth of sustainability services. And it's only a matter of time for vendor procurement preferences to start leaning into ESG compliant companies. As I mentioned a moment ago, while privately held companies in the United States may not be subjected directly to these upcoming regulations by the SEC, we fully expect implications to touch all design firms at all levels, because either your firm may be in the value chain of publicly held companies, which would then trigger the need for you to report, or you're going to see ESG compliant provisions in your contracts. We're starting to see those kinds of requirements coming through in the supplier codes of conduct provisions. So as you review your professional service contracts, don't forget to read the fine print or to actually dig deeper into those codes of conduct provisions within or that are being referenced in your contracts, because you're going to start to see some growth there. The same goes for procurement preferences in public works. Public entities, federal, state, local, they are building in ESG or climate-related procurement requirements. And then the last point on this slide is to keep in mind that project development financing will continue to be shaped by climate and ESG investment decisions for years to come. So let's pivot now to what you can do as a firm to get ahead of these ESG trends. So if you don't have a business plan that gives your customers and clients some insight into your sustainability strategy, this would be a first good step. Just as you develop your business plans, we recommend that you enhance those plans with sustainability strategies and embed that sustainability thinking and mindset into those business plans. And you would do so with, summary of sustainability opportunities and challenges, acknowledging those challenges, setting goals with, hard and fast KPIs, key performance indicators, and a prioritized list of initiatives, as well as an implementation plan. So as you're developing that sustainability strategy, or if you're enhancing what you already have, you're going to want to map and weave into your plan the metrics and goals from internationally recognized standards, like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board standard, or the Global Reporting Initiative standard, GRI. And also you might consider the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures framework. And this is going to, by doing that, by mapping your sustainability strategies with these standards, it's going to help your clients, any investors or financial institutions looking at your website to see how your services match their ESG required needs. And this is going to help you position your firm in the marketplace, especially when ESG inquiries or requests for proposals are made and you're responding, because fundamentally, ESG literacy and the vocabulary of sustainability accounting standards isn't necessarily new to the design industry, but because it's now being institutionalized in the financial world, it's going to be important for design firms like yourselves to communicate in alignment and in the same language and vocabulary. So I should note that none of the standards listed on this slide are necessarily considered the best international standard to follow. In fact, as we speak, there is what's called the International Sustainability Standards Board. It is actively working with regulators around the world, including United States regulators, to develop guidelines and perhaps provide markets with maybe 2 standards instead of several global standards. And this will help, assuming this happens in the next few months, which my understanding is there is a goal to get it done by the end of this year. It will help with that standardization and collection of ESG data. But let's take a look quickly at one of the standards. I'm gonna take a deeper look at the SASB standard because we are limited on time, but I want to tie it back to quantitative and qualitative metrics so you kind of understand how those metrics look. Okay, so we're going to look at, as I said, the SASB standard. Just be aware that in the SASB suite of standards, there are 77 industry-specific sustainability accounting standards. So for purposes of today, we are looking at one of those. You can see here at the bottom of the slide, the Engineering and Construction Services Standard. And I chose this because this description, when you look at the SASB standard, you look at the description, it aligns well with pretty much the majority of design services. If you end up deciding to use the standard, this particular standard, the SASB standard, you may also want to take a look at the Professional and Commercial Services Standard because there are some other metrics related to professional services, like related to data security, workforce diversity, and professional integrity. So, you might want to take a look at those two pieces as you get started. Okay, so on the screen, I've created another chart, and this chart it's just to highlight what those the 6 areas of disclosure topics are within SASB. And by the way, I forgot to mention, engineering and construction services also includes, by definition, architectural design, interior design, and other design services. I don't understand why you're not specifically called out in the title of the standard, but nevertheless, engineering includes architectural, interior design, and other design services. All right, so let's move on and look at the various disclosure topics here within this particular standard and how they have quantitative and qualitative metrics defined. All right, so looking at environmental impacts. So this standard recognizes, first off, that every project has some level of risk to the local environment and to surrounding communities, whether it disrupts the local ecosystem and its biodiversity, or the emissions in the air during construction, or water discharge, or the use of hazardous substances. There's tons of issues in there that are laid out, but it's really what they're interested in is how you manage those environmental impacts to stave off project delays or community pushback or project cancellations. They also want to know whether you've ever had to pay fines or do any remediation. And if so, they want to know what those metrics are, like how many did you, how much did you have to pay, or how much work did you have to do, or did that ever happen? So that's where the quantitative and qualitative information, they're trying to tease out that quantitative and qualitative information from design firms. So moving on to structural integrity and safety. There is keen awareness by the standard that design professionals are licensed professionals with responsibility to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare, that you have a standard of care. And there's also concern around the uncertainty of climate change and the impacts on the built environment on making climate change worse, so increasing global warming. And the standard specifically acknowledges that designing to code isn't necessarily going to be enough for structural integrity and safety. So what they're looking for here is to find out more how design firms are managing this uncertainty or protecting against the physical risks of climate. Moving on to workforce health and safety right here. Because this standard combines both design and construction services, depending on how your firm engages during construction, this may or may not align with your practice, but you'll want to look at the types of information within this particular section of disclosure, whether you need to disclose metrics that would be meaningful to those audiences. Then moving on to life cycle impacts of buildings and infrastructure. So this is the disclosure area where the standard is honing in on how your firm specifies materials, so like embodied carbon, or how your firm helps owners manage the consumption of energy and water during operations, because there is keen recognition that the built environment is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. And they are looking to understand better, as well as things like negative human health outcomes, indoor air quality, those kinds of things. But so the standard is trying to solicit information and data from design firms for you to describe how do you approach these challenges and quantify the number of projects that perhaps you've done that are certified to some third-party standard like LEED or there are plenty of other sustainable standards. Ultimately, the focus here, again, from a financial standpoint, is an understanding of how your firm might either lose market share because you're not doing these kinds of things, or indeed you are contributing to the growth and demand for sustainable design services because you're focused on this kind of this area of growing market demand. Moving on to climate impacts of business risks. This standard is soliciting information from your firm to understand whether your project mix is in line with climate adaptive and climate mitigating projects, or are you heavily dependent on fossil generation? Then lastly, business ethics, as I mentioned earlier, what they want to know or understand better is whether you've had any history of unethical bidding practices. If so, how many? Whether your firm has ever violated any bribery laws or experienced any other ethical breaches that could cause your firm to either suffer reputational damage or lose market share. Okay, so the last bit of advice I have is, as you begin your ESG journey, review these standards, talk to your peers and professional associations to gauge their approaches, use the standards basically as a reference point, and then weave them into your actual business plans or your sustainability strategies. But I will note that you should be kind to yourself, be mindful that this process of documenting ESG data and investors and financial institutions delving into a company's sustainability strategy is a rather new thing for financial markets, at least outside of Fortune 500 companies. So no one is expecting businesses to be perfect on this by any stretch, but what is becoming more expected is that you have some sustainability strategy in place and you've begun the journey. So be careful also to avoid overstating what your firm can do. All of the regulation that's happening in US markets is clearly intended to prevent greenwashing and to provide transparency for investors and financial stakeholders. So you want to be careful, you want to be reasonable, and you want to be authentic in your strategies. So lastly, as you can see by everything I've discussed so far, ESG is a big sustainability topic that for most is just too big and too broad to master at all levels. But having a plan in place that acknowledges with metrics where you are in your ESG journey, even if it's just a start, is going to give you a baseline with which to report annually, either on your website or in your annual corporate reports. I'm excited to announce that Victor is launching an ESG risk rating tool to help our insureds assess their ESG performance. And we're aiming to have this tool launched in the next month, hopefully. But keep an eye out in your inbox. We will be making announcements and sending our policyholders an email, so you'll be getting that. And what it is, it's a self-assessment tool that was developed and based on 10 internationally recognized standards and frameworks, and it tailors your rating based on your industry. You will have an opportunity to select your industry when you do your assessment. It's a great starting point to help you understand where your firm excels or where you might need additional focus and effort. You can take the quiz over if you need to improve. And when we launch, we'll be offering additional webinars like this to help you understand this product, its utility, and to help you navigate a way forward. So lastly, we've also created a dedicated resource page on ESG issues for our insureds. So you might want to take a look at that. And with that, today's webinar is concluded. I know I've given you a lot to think about, a lot to digest, but I hope it helps your firm and practice moving forward and thinking about ESG and the next steps you want to take. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you have a great day.